I'll call to order the City Finance Committee meeting for October 24th. We have one item on our agenda, the fiscal year 2017 preliminary year-end results. And is there anyone in the audience who'd like to speak to anything not on our agenda? Seeing no one, we'll go to the first item on our agenda. Mr. Samario.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Samario, Finance Director. So we're calling this the preliminary year-end results. We are almost through with our audit. The auditors have been out and gone. There's still some more work to be done before we produce what we call our comprehensive financial report, the CAFR. That's due to come to council in December. The numbers are just about final, but there's always a possibility that they could change. So that's why we're still calling them preliminary numbers. But for all practical purposes, they're final. You know, we might have some movement there. But we're here to show you, instead of having to wait till December, we wanted to kind of tell you where we're at the end of the year for fiscal year 17, and with a focus on our reserves. How did our reserves end? Where are we at June 30, 2017? So I do want to just remind you of some of the revenue performances, how they came in, same with expenditures. Ms. Demas and Ms. Tomaszewski have previously on 2 occasions gone over those in a lot of detail. So I wasn't planning on going into too much detail, but certainly I'm here and they're here to answer any questions if you want to get into that detail. At council today, it's going to be the same report. So this is an opportunity if you want to kind of refresh yourselves on some of what happened with some of those revenues or expenditures. We're certainly welcome to discuss those. We're happy to discuss those. So then we'll get into the year-end results, kind of a summary, and then the reserves. And then a question we'll be asking council today. It has to do with how we allocate the year-end surplus, and we'll get into that. But it's really in relation to our policy that we established a number of years ago, several years ago, but where we've changed that temporarily in light of the fact that at one point, we were not fulfilling our reserve requirements. So we had been given direction to only allocate 25% of their reserves to capital versus 50%. But we'll see how that plays out. So the revenue performance, looking at just taxes as a category, highlighting the key ones. Property taxes came in over budget by about $772,000. In terms of how it relates to the prior year, it's about a 7% increase from prior year. So it's been very strong in the last few years as property values and assessed values have gone up. But in relation to budget, $772,000. And we expect that this year we're going to see something similar in terms of how it's performing. We're expecting anywhere from a 5 to 6% growth, at least on the secured and unsecured. We don't know where supplemental taxes will come in and things like that, but for the most part, we can count on a pretty strong growth this year. Sales taxes is where we've seen poor performance. We essentially came in flat relative to last year and below budget by almost $1 million. So we've been impacted certainly by what's going on the retail sector. Restaurants and car sales are doing okay. Restaurants are doing actually very well, but the retail sector is just not performing, as you know, with the closure of Macy's and all that stuff. That's really impacting our sales tax numbers. On the TOT side, our transient occupancy taxes, you can see we're about $500,000 below budget. In terms of growth from prior year, we're about a 3% growth. Most of that sort of lackluster growth and the variance with budget has to do with the fact that we forecast and anticipate some loss in TOT from vacation rentals, but we started seeing that more of a bigger loss than we anticipated. So that's really what's driving that lack of growth and the numbers this year. And then lastly, business license taxes, we're actually doing a little bit better than budget by $173. But over just those numbers alone account for about $520,000 shortfall in our budget to actual. Some other revenues, just to point out, because they're fairly significant, engineering work orders. These are the revenues that we generate in the engineering division within the general fund for work that they perform on capital projects. They charge their time out just like a consultant would do so. And they assumed and budgeted about $5.1 million in revenues, but only generated just under $4 million. This has to do with several reasons. Primarily, though, it's vacancies. There were some vacancies, a number of vacancies in the engineering division. So on the expenditure side, as you'll see in the Public Works Department, you'll see a pretty large variance on the expenditure side because of those vacancies. It's not a one-to-one sort of relationship, meaning that for every dollar of salaries that's saved, you actually lose about 1.2%, 1.2 in revenues because of the way they charge those people out. The franchise fees, this is just to point out that this was an unbudgeted item. We had a favorable outcome or decision at the state Supreme Court, which determined that the case that was, or the argument that the 1% franchise fee on electricity that was adopted in the early 2000s, it was argued that it was a tax and not a fee, and we were successful in this case that it was determined to not be a tax. We have a little bit of work to do in establishing that the fee itself isn't exorbitant relative to what the value that they're getting, but we've been holding some of those revenues aside and not treating them as revenue until we got a better idea. But with that decision, we felt comfortable in recognizing those monies as revenues in 2017. And we have adjusted our 2018 budget accordingly. And then building permits, you've been hearing a lot about how much activity they've been seeing in the last year, yet their revenues are below budget by $200,000. We talked a little bit about this before, and it's because building permits come in all shapes and sizes, and you can have a lot of volume, but if they're very small building permits or developments, it's not going to generate as much as if you have a few large ones, and that's what happened last year, and what we had budgeted, we used as our basis for this year, but we've seen just more volume, smaller projects, which caused that to be below budget by the end of the year. So a little bit not quite intuitive, but that's how it played out. And then traffic violations, these are the moving violations that are issued by our motor officers. We see that we're below budget, and this is primarily because of just down in staff on police in general and how they've managed and shifted people around. They have not been fully staffed for the motor cops, so we've seen a reduction in the number of citations that have been issued, and they're short, so the revenues go down accordingly. On the expenditure side, I mentioned about salary savings. I just pointed out the 5 departments where we've seen the biggest impact from vacancies. In the police department, it's the largest for sure. They're about $1.8 million below budget. Again, primarily vacancies. I know there are a number of people in the academy that started in October. And I think, we've been doing a much better job in terms of the recruitment effort and all that, but, sometimes you have unexpected retirements that kind of affect that. But, we're on the right trend and the right track, but still for 17, we still generated about $1.9 million in savings. On the public works side, again, I mentioned the engineering work quarters. This is where we see most of the vacancies. You can see the savings of $984. Not quite the $1 million, almost $1.2 million in revenue shortfall, but still it offsets some of those revenues. In community development, we have a number of vacancies. You can see the savings there. Parks and Recreation, same thing. And then library, we've had a hard time filling those positions, a lot of turnover. But in total, just those 5 departments generated almost $5.1 million in expenditure savings. So from a budgetary perspective and reserve perspective, good news in terms of being able to deliver services and in operations and all that. It's not necessarily a good news story. So I'm going to get into a summary schedule that shows kind of combines revenues and expenditures, how we performed in 2017 relative to budget. But I wanted just to point out something. So when we look at the current budget, the current amended budget for 17, or I should say the final amended budget, it did involve the use or the budgeted use of reserves. And I wanted to kind of describe where that came from because, as you know, every year we adopt a balanced budget, and during the year we have these amendments. But I wanted to kind of give an accounting of some of those things. One of the largest items that kind of carries over and shows the use of reserves are the encumbrances at the end of the year. So in 2016, at the end of fiscal year 2016, we had about almost $1.1 million in encumbrances and in contracts that were carried over. So those are purchase orders that have been executed, contracts that have been executed, and some discretionary carryovers that the city administrator has authority to carry over. When they get carried over, it immediately shows the use of reserves. It doesn't affect what we kind of tell you what our reserve balances are relative to our policy because we sort of set those aside already, but it does on a budgetary basis, and when you look at the document, it'll still show the use of reserves, but we've already accounted for that. One of the things that also shows as a use of reserves was a loan to the city TV. They wanted to purchase some equipment, some HD equipment, and so we kind of advanced some of the money this year in 18. They're going to pay that back. And then because of the timing of the closing of the books and all that and getting final numbers, that direction to allocate 25% of the surplus in 16 into capital was not done until fiscal year 17. So it sort of shows as the use of reserve, but it's because it's a year-end surplus from the prior year that we're really moving over. And then we had asked and recommended to council, and they approved the transfer of some of that year-end surplus in 16 to fund a shortfall in fire equipment reserves. You know, with these pieces of equipment, the fire apparatus are costing more and more money, and we're tracking that, and we're putting money aside every year. But just because of the increase in cost relative to what we anticipated, we're a little short. So we did move some of that year-end surplus of 160 into those reserves. And it primarily came from the fact that we had mutual aid revenues in 16 that exceeded cost that helped generate those surpluses. So we thought it made sense to kind of transfer that to the fire equipment reserve. And then during the year, we had the special election, Measure D, for the marijuana excise tax that did require the use of reserves of $112,000. And then we also spent $55,000 for infrastructure polling, and that came out of reserves. So really a small amount that was truly in terms of extra or unanticipated. Most of that was things like the surplus of capital, the encumbrances carryover that drove that large number. And I show that to you because this is where you see kind of the overall summary for the whole year of all revenues and expenditures. So I'm going to kind of work vertically first. So the amended budget, revenues were budgeted at $129.5 million. The expenditures were budgeted at $131.7 million for a net of 2.1, which is that budgeted use of reserves that I just went over in terms of the details. Our preliminary results, and for all practical purposes, our final results for the year brought in $127.6 million of revenues and 126.9 of expenditures. So the net of those two is what you would call, I guess, a net gain or loss. It was the net surplus in this case of $662,000. And that 662 will fall to our reserve balances, and that's really what we're going to be asking you. How much of that should we be allocating to policy reserves versus capital reserves? Our normal policy is 50-50. We've been given direction to allocate that sort of differently for 2-3 years. But I wanted to show you, it's kind of interesting when you look over to the right, the variance between the actual results and the budget. It's a little bit interesting because you can see revenues $2 million under budget. Again, sales taxes and TOT engineering work orders are the largest drivers of that. And then expenditures about $3.9 million under budget. You will recall that every year we have what's called an anticipated year-end variance number, where we anticipate some expenditure savings and we budget for that. And that is actually budgeted as a revenue, but I've adjusted these numbers to kind of reflect that so it doesn't look so odd. So even though expenditures came in somewhere around almost $6 million under budget, 2.3 of that, 2.3 million was already anticipated. So the true variance was 3.9. So on a net basis, the variance from budget is 1.9, and I've been asked this question: well, why don't we get the 1.9? What doesn't that go into our reserves? Why is it only the 662? And the 1.9 is just a measure of performance. You know, budget versus actuals. We went from a $2.2 million projected use of reserves to a $1.9 million sort of only a 662 use of a surplus. So that's the variance of 1.9. So it's really not a number you can say that's going to fall to reserves. It's just kind of a measure of performance. But the important number is that second column of numbers, which is how actual revenues and how actual expenditures ended the year when you start talking about what's the impact of reserve balances. Any questions on that? I know it's a little confusing, but.
Councilmember White?
And we'll get into reserves after this. I just wanted to see if there are any questions on this part of it.
It's actually the slide previous that encumbrances and C/Os.
Yeah, carryovers. So the things that we consider.
Big ones.
Yeah,
the top two or whatever.
Yeah, I don't think there's any top one or two. So at the end of each year, we always have purchase orders that have been executed but have not we have not received the services or contracts, and it's typically in about $1 million range, and it could be for anything, and it's spread across all departments, and it's
Complete
yeah,
transactions.
Yeah,
that-
they're not.
that-
We can't count them.
escrow, as it were.
Yeah, we can't count them as expenditures yet because we haven't received the services. That only when we receive services do we count them as expenditures. But they are obligations, and so we recognize them at year end, and then we carry over the next year as obligations. And by doing so, it automatically sort of adds to the use of reserves. But as I said, we already kind of count that and in terms of measuring our available reserves in that end of that year. So it's not like we're truly, it's not an unanticipated use of reserves that we haven't provided for. And carryovers are things that are more discretionary. It's a small dollar amount, but for special projects that are kind of one-time funding that weren't completed, the city administrator has the authority to carry those over.
Are there other questions? Okay, keep going, Mr. Samario.
Okay, so this is now kind of where our reserves are, or at June 30, 2017, again, based on preliminary numbers that we think are pretty final. So as you know, we have two pots of reserves. One is the disaster reserve that is calculated as 15% of the operating budget for the next fiscal year. So in this case, $19,167,000 happens to be 15% of the 2018 adopted operating budget. And then the contingency reserve is 10% of the adopted operating budget for fiscal year 18. So in total, our policy would say that we needed almost $32 million in reserves. And as you can see, our actual balances, we always keep the disaster reserves fully funded. In this case, we have contingency reserves in excess of what our policy says, to the tune of $1.56 million. In your agenda report and in the attachment, the number that's shown here is closer to 1.8, 1,000,007 something. And I've adjusted for that because it was brought to my attention that $200,000 roughly of grant revenues were received by the Public Works Department to reimburse for an underground tank replacement project. And so we thought it was appropriate to kind of hold that money aside and sort of designate it for future similar projects. So we've reduced that 1.7 by that $200,000, so it's 1.5. But even with that adjustment, that number is well above where we've been for years. The last time we had anything near this number above policy was in 2004, fiscal year 2004. So since then, we've either been below or right at policy. So it's really good news from in terms of a reserve perspective. So this kind of gives you the long-term history. You could see in 2005 we were at policy. Prior to that we were above, but since then we went for a number of years, 9 years, we were below policy until 2015, and we've sort of stayed right at policy. And then this current year we actually have some cushion there, the 1.5 million. So the direction we're going to be looking to get from council is this question I asked. And when we were back in 2015, or at the end of 15, when we weren't sure we were going to get to policy reserves, that council directed us to split any surpluses 75%, 25%, 75% going to our policy reserves to give us a higher degree of certainty that we'd actually get to policy reserves. And that was a 3-year direction, so 15, 16, and 17. 17 being the last year, but given that we are now well above policy reserves at $1.5 million, it just raises the question, do we need to stick with that 75-25% split, or can we go back to the 50-50 split? And if we were to do that, it's really the difference between splitting the 662 in half or taking 25% of that and putting that to capital. So the committee is welcome to make a recommendation if you'd like, but I'm going to be presenting this to the full council, asking for direction on how we allocate those reserves. So with that completes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions or comments? Councilmember White?
Thank you. Well, on the reserves, to sort of backtrack to some years, we're trying to restore those reserves. And that's what's been accomplished. But my notion would be, and we have, of course, as we know, our unfunded liabilities are massive. So I would think a good way to go forward would be to peel off the money that is over policy reserve. What we want to have is policy reserves. We don't, more money is always better than less. But whatever, these formulas of 50% and 25%, all that was because we were trying to get our reserves back up to policy. We're there. It's going to change year to year as the budgets presumably increase. But clearly the need for the capital programs is there. And so I hope that the committee consider taking everything above policy and moving it into the capital program.
Councilmember White? Or excuse me, Dominguez.
I had a question about normal reserves. Is that just the disaster and contingency reserves? Is that what comprises normal reserves?
Yes, our reserves, let's see, yes, normal reserves are our policy reserves.
Okay.
The two pots.
That's the only question I had.
Is there anyone who'd like to speak on this item? Okay, no, we'll just close the public hearing then. Well, I agree with Councilmember White. I think that is exactly the strategy we tried to achieve, which is to bring the reserves into full policy levels, and that the additional revenue ought to go for capital expenditures. That's clearly the pressing need. I think the public understands that, and I would agree with that recommendation to the council. Anybody want to make a motion?
I just wanted to hear from Mr. Dominguez if you have any comments on that. Okay, then I would move that the funds over our policy reserves be recommended to be allocated to our capital program.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed and abstained. Matter carries unanimously, and that is the last item on our agenda, so we are adjourned.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.